want to start with a simple question, not a complicated one, not one that requires advanced degrees or access to classified archives, just a question that, once you ask it, becomes genuinely difficult to stop asking. Why, in virtually every corner of the world, at virtually the same moment in history, did human beings abandon the most efficient food production system ever devised and then spend the next 200 years pretending it never existed? That's it. That's the whole question. But the deeper I went, the more that simple question started to pull at something much larger. Something that touches maps that were altered, forests that were cleared on schedules that defy natural explanation, and an almost total erasure of a body of knowledge so comprehensive, so ancient, and so effective that its disappearance should be considered one of the most significant events in recorded human history. Should be, isn't. That silence alone tells you something. It started, as these things often do, with a footnote. I was going through a collection of botanical survey reports from the early 1800s, the kind of documents that get digitized and uploaded to university archives and then largely forgotten. Field notes from surveyors mostly. Men sent ahead of colonial expansion to catalogue what was there before the roads came through. And what they described repeatedly across dozens of separate surveys conducted on 4 different continents was the same thing. Forests that fed people, not metaphorically, not incidentally, but systematically, purposefully, with a level of biological engineering that the surveyors themselves kept struggling to articulate because they had no framework for it. One British surveyor, writing from the Deccan Plateau in 1817, described walking for 3 days through what he called an arrangement of trees so convenient to the traveller that one begins to suspect the hand of man in the placement of each species. A French naturalist writing from the interior of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1832 noted an almost impossible abundance of fruit-bearing trees, nut-bearing trees and medicinal plants occupying the same ground in an order that no accident of nature could produce. An order that no accident of nature could produce, that phrase stopped me cold. Because here's the thing. These 2 men, an English surveyor and a French naturalist, never met, never corresponded, were operating on different continents, in different ecosystems, writing in different languages. And yet they were describing the same thing, using almost the same language. That's either a remarkable coincidence, or it's evidence of something real. The deeper I looked, the more I found this pattern repeating. Survey after survey, continent after continent, from the 1790s through roughly the 1860s. A world that was, in certain key regions, not wilderness in the way we understand that word today, but something closer to a managed, layered, multi-species food production system operating at continental scale. And then, gone. Not gradually, not through the slow march of deforestation or climate shift, but gone. In a window of decades so compressed that the transition barely registers in the official record. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were they clearing? Let's start in England, because England gives us something useful. Documentation. The royal forests. Most people know that term and assume it refers to hunting grounds, land reserved for kings to chase deer. And yes, that's part of the story. But the official explanation collapses here when you actually look at the Domesday Book of 1086 and the forest surveys that followed it. The royal forests of Norman England covered, at their peak, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire country. An enormous fraction. And the forest laws enacted to protect them were, by the standards of any era, extraordinarily severe. You could be blinded, mutilated, or executed for taking game from a royal forest. The standard explanation is that this was about aristocratic privilege, about hunting rights. But here's the strangest part. You couldn't take game from these forests. You also couldn't take timber. You couldn't clear land within them. You couldn't farm in them or graze livestock in them or build structures in them. The restrictions weren't just about hunting. They were about preserving the totality of the ecosystem, a forest where nothing could be removed except, in certain circumstances, by licensed rights called common of mast, common of pannage, common of estivers. And what was being protected under these arcane rights? The mast, the fruit of the forest, acorns, beechnuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts. The estivers, the right to take certain branches, were calibrated carefully to allow harvest without destruction. These weren't hunting grounds, not primarily. They were managed food systems, and the laws around them were designed, whether intentionally or not, to prevent their destruction. Then came the Enclosure Acts between roughly 1750 and 1850. In wave after wave of parliamentary legislation, the common forests and commons of England were systematically privatised, cleared, and converted to agricultural monoculture. Millions of acres. Within 2 generations, a food system that had sustained rural populations for centuries, in some cases for millennia, was dismantled, fenced off, and ploughed under. The official story is that this was modernisation, efficiency, progress. But look at the timeline, look at who authorised it, and look at what replaced it. Not a better food system, a more controllable one, a system that required seeds to be purchased, land to be rented, labour to be sold. A system in which no one could simply walk into a forest and eat. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now move across the Atlantic. Before European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes region, and throughout what is now California, maintained food production systems of extraordinary sophistication. The Kalapuya of the Willamette Valley burned their landscapes on precise cycles to manage the growth of Kama's bulb meadows and oak groves. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy practiced companion planting at landscape scale with what they call the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but also maintained extensive food forests of nut-bearing trees, berry thickets, and medicinal plants that buffered and supplemented agriculture across vast territories. The early European observers who encountered these landscapes were almost universally confused by them. They described the American landscape as park-like, as if someone had designed it, as if someone had maintained it, which of course someone had. For thousands of years, the first British colonial administrator to formally document the Carolina Piedmont in the late 1600s wrote about groves of pecan, walnut, and chestnut trees so well spaced and tended that an Englishman might mistake the whole for an orchard of great age. He was almost certainly right. It was an orchard, a food forest maintained across generations, across centuries by people who understood that a tree properly placed and tended will feed your grandchildren's grandchildren without your grandchildren doing anything at all. And then the clearing began. Not the slow clearing of individual farmers moving west. Something faster, something that felt, to the few who noticed it, almost coordinated. By the time the United States conducted its first systematic timber surveys in the 1880s, forest coverage that had been documented by colonial surveyors just 2 and 3 generations earlier had already vanished. The oral knowledge that went with it, the specific understanding of which species to plant together, which trees to select over centuries to produce the most abundant mast, how to read a forest landscape as a food production system, went with the people who held it. Suppressed, displaced, erased, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. If you're watching this and something about this pattern is pulling at you the way it pulled at me, if you're finding yourself going back to look at old maps and old survey documents and wondering why you never heard about this in school, consider sharing this with someone you think should see it. The conversations that start in the comments section of videos like this have led me to sources I never would have found otherwise, which is how this kind of research works, which is maybe why it gets harder to find. Now let's talk about the Amazon, because the Amazon is where this whole line of inquiry gets hardest to dismiss. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus held that the Amazon rainforest was, essentially, a pristine wilderness, a climax ecosystem untouched by significant human modification. This was the official position. It was taught in schools, it was repeated in documentaries. It was almost certainly wrong. Beginning in earnest in the 1990s, researchers studying a phenomenon known as terra preta, dark earth in Portuguese, started to realize that enormous sections of the Amazon basin contained soil that was fundamentally different from the surrounding red clay. Darker, richer, almost impossibly fertile, even after centuries of tropical weathering that should have degraded any organic material into nothing. Terra preta isn't natural. Its composition, charred organic matter, bone, ceramic fragments, carefully managed microbial communities, indicates deliberate human manufacture on a massive scale. Some estimates suggest it covers somewhere between 0.1% and 10% of the entire Amazon basin. That's potentially hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of deliberately engineered soil. And here's where it connects to the food forest question. Wherever researchers found terra preta, they found above it an anomalous concentration of useful species: palms, Brazil nut trees, cacao, peach palm, acai, species that provide food, that grow in the specific combinations that support human nutrition, that don't occur in those combinations, in those densities by accident. What researchers were looking at in patch after patch across an area the size of a continent was evidence of a food production system, a designed system, an engineered system, one that was operating at a scale and with a sophistication that the official historical timeline has, until recently, refused to accommodate, and then the colonists arrived. By some estimates, the population of the Amazon basin declined by between 50% and 90% in the century following European contact. The people who maintained these food forests, who held the generations of observational knowledge required to manage them, died in catastrophic numbers. In a span of time so compressed that the forests themselves began to revert to what looked like wilderness before any European naturalist thought to document what had been there. The official explanation is disease, smallpox, measles, plague, and yes, disease was real and devastating and terrible in a way that we should not minimize. But this raises a simple but critical question. If the food forests were already there, if the trees were already planted, already producing, already requiring minimal maintenance, why weren't they preserved? Why didn't the colonists, who were often desperately hungry, simply use what was there? Why clear it? Let's now look at the timeline. And I want to be precise here because precision is what makes this so difficult to dismiss. Across England, the Enclosure Acts reached their peak between 1750 and 1850. Across North America, the systematic clearing of indigenous food systems accelerates dramatically between 1780 and 1880. Across the Amazon, the largest single wave of deforestation affecting ancient food forest zones occurs in the 19th century, following the rubber boom. Across West Africa, the systematic dismantling of what colonists documented as sacred grove food systems, complex multi-species food forests maintained by communities and protected by cultural law, occurs primarily between 1820 and 1900, concurrent with the consolidation of European colonial administration. Across South and Southeast Asia, the British and Dutch colonial administrations introduced land tenure reforms in the mid to late 1800s that effectively criminalize common forest use and begin the conversion of managed polyculture forests to monoculture plantation agriculture. Different empires, different continents, different ecosystems, different crops, different peoples. Same window of time. Not the same century, not the same half-century, the same few decades. The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidence operating here, something more than the mere spread of agricultural ideology. because agricultural ideology had existed in Europe for thousands of years. Monoculture farming wasn't new in 1800. The clearing of forests wasn't new. What was new was the scale, the speed, and the universality. The coordination problem is frankly impossible to resolve within the official framework. You cannot explain using standard historical mechanisms how administrators operating under different governments, speaking different languages, following different legal traditions with no known channels of direct coordination, managed to implement virtually identical policies regarding forest clearance in virtually identical timeframes across 6 of the 7 continents. You can't. The official explanation breaks here. Something was organising this, whether that organising force was ideological, institutional, or something else, something we don't have clean language for, I genuinely cannot tell you. But the pattern is there, it is documented, and it demands explanation. Here's something that I think gets overlooked in most discussions of lost agricultural knowledge. Trees take time. A chestnut tree, planted from seed, takes 30 to 40 years to reach full production. An oak, 80 to 100 years before it begins producing significant mast. A pecan, 20 to 25 years. A walnut, similar. What this means is that a food forest is not a system you build for yourself. You build it for your children, your grandchildren. You plant trees you will never harvest from, because your grandparents planted trees for you. The knowledge required to maintain a food forest isn't just botanical, it's generational. It exists in the relationship between a community and a landscape that has been tended over many human lifetimes. When that community is dispersed, displaced, or destroyed, when the grandchildren no longer live where the grandparents planted, the knowledge doesn't just fade, it breaks, catastrophically and essentially permanently. And here's the strangest part. The same period that saw the large-scale destruction of food forest systems worldwide also saw the establishment of something that looks, at first glance, like its opposite. The world-spanning botanical garden network. Kew Gardens in London expanding dramatically after 1840. The Royal Botanic Garden in Calcutta, founded 1787. Bogor Botanical Gardens in Java, 1817. The Missouri Botanical Garden, 1859. Singapore Botanic Gardens formalised 1859. Sydney's Royal Botanic Garden formalised in the 1850s. Garden after garden. Institution after institution. In the same decades, the food forests were being cleared. Now, this could be coincidence. Perhaps the same imperial impulse that drove land clearance also drove a desire to catalogue and preserve species. But here's what I find strange. These botanical gardens preserved specimens. They collected. They classified. What they generally did not do is redistribute. They didn't take the layered polyculture knowledge of a functioning food forest, the specific combinations, the succession patterns, the management practices, and preserve that. They preserved the trees, not the system. They kept the parts, but they lost or discarded or perhaps deliberately did not preserve the instructions. Why? This raises a simple but critical question that I haven't seen anyone in mainstream history answer satisfactorily. If the goal was the preservation of plant knowledge, why was the knowledge of how to use plants collectively at landscape scale, across generations for food sovereignty, almost entirely absent from what these institutions chose to preserve? I want to talk briefly about a single species because it illustrates the broader pattern in a way that's hard to argue with. The American chestnut. Before 1904, the American chestnut, Castanea dentata, was arguably the most important food tree in eastern North America. It grew from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio Valley. It represented approximately a quarter of all trees in the eastern deciduous forest. It produced enormous quantities of nutritious, easily storable, freely available nuts every single autumn with zero human input. Indigenous peoples had incorporated it into food systems for thousands of years. Rural Appalachian communities in the 1800s relied on it substantially. Settlers' hogs were fattened on chestnut mast. People ate them roasted in city streets. You could not, in 1900, walk through most of the eastern United States without being within easy reach of free food. In 1904, a fungal blight introduced, the record says, via Asian chestnut trees imported to the Bronx Zoo, entered the population. By 1940, approximately 4 billion American chestnut trees were dead. 4 billion, the fastest and most complete biological collapse of a keystone food species ever recorded, a species that had, for millennia, provided free, abundant calories to every human being in its range, eliminated in a single human lifetime. The official explanation is an accident of horticultural import, a single infected batch of trees. A tragedy, but the timing. Consider the timing. The American chestnut dies at exactly the moment when the industrialization of food was accelerating. At exactly the moment when centralized food production, corporate food production, was beginning to emerge. At the precise historical juncture when the existence of a free, abundant, decentralized food source would have been most economically inconvenient. I'm not telling you what to conclude from this. I'm just describing what the record shows. Now let's talk about what the old maps actually show. There is a category of cartographic document that historians treat as essentially primitive. The pre-1850 vegetation maps, the regional surveys, the hand-drawn territorial descriptions produced by early colonial scouts and naturalists. These documents are available. They're in archives. They've been digitized. You can look at them, and if you look at them and then look at satellite imagery of the same regions today, something becomes immediately apparent. The density is wrong. The old maps consistently describe forest coverage in regions that are now partially or fully cleared that is dramatically greater than anything the official deforestation narrative accounts for. They describe forests where there shouldn't be forests, dense, mature, multi-species forests in regions that, by the official timeline, should have been grassland or savanna. Maps of interior West Africa from the 1820s describe continuous forest belts crossing regions that climate science tells us should not have supported them. Early Portuguese maps of coastal Brazil show forest species compositions in areas that modern ecology says are climatically inappropriate. The standard explanation is cartographic error, primitive surveying techniques, artistic license, but the same error repeated by different surveyors in different regions across a century of documentation. The official explanation collapses here. There is a theory, one I'm not ready to endorse, but one I'm also not willing to dismiss, that what these surveyors were documenting was not natural forest at all, but the remnants of intentional planting. Trees established across centuries and millennia in patterns that produced what looked like wild forest, but was actually managed landscape. A planet whose most productive regions had been over vast periods of time slowly and deliberately planted as food systems operating below the threshold of what later observers could identify as agriculture, not farms, not gardens, not wilderness, something in between. Something we don't have a good word for because the concept was erased along with the practice. And here's where the Tartaria question enters, because I want to be careful about this and careful about what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming there was an empire called Tartaria. The cartographic record is more complicated than that. What I will say is this. On maps produced before roughly 1700, the regions now occupied by Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe are described with a specificity and an ecological richness that is almost entirely absent from maps produced after 1800, not just politically, ecologically. The species recorded, the agricultural traditions noted, the density of inhabited and managed landscape. Something changed in those regions between 1700 and 1850 that the official historical record doesn't adequately explain. What changed? I don't know, but the question matters. I've spent a long time now looking at what was said about food forests in the official record, the academic papers, the agricultural reports, the colonial surveys, but I've spent almost as much time looking at what wasn't said. The gaps are remarkable. Look at the major agricultural reform movements of the mid-1800s. The publications, the pamphlets, the government reports that drove the massive land reorganisations of that period. They discuss soil chemistry, crop rotation, yield efficiency, labour productivity. They discuss at length the inferiority of traditional farming methods and the superiority of the modern approach. What they almost never discuss is polyculture food forests, not to dismiss them, not to debate them, not to acknowledge their existence at all. In agricultural literature covering the period of the food forest disappearance, the food forest is simply absent, as a concept, as a practice, as something requiring refutation or replacement. You don't argue against something you want people to forget existed. The silence was deafening, and it extended into the physical record in ways that still confound me. There are regions in England, in the Welsh borders, in parts of Ireland, where the field boundaries, the ancient hedgerows, the deep lanes, the sunken roads lined with old trees, preserve what can only be described as ghost food forests. Hazel, crabapple, elder, wild plum, damson, sloe, cobnut, sweet chestnut, mulberry. Species that don't colonize together naturally. Species that require planting in combinations that suggest someone knew exactly what they were doing. These hedgerow systems are, conservatively, several hundred years old in many cases. Some may be much older. They represent, and I say this having spent a great deal of time with people who study them, the encoded memory of a planting system. A system where the hedge itself was the food forest, contracted to a linear form as the open forests were cleared, preserved in the margins because the margins were the last places the enclosures reached. A compressed survival, a whisper of the original, and even these marginal survivors have been removed at rates of thousands of miles per decade in Britain throughout the 20th century. The official reason: agricultural efficiency. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to say something directly to you, whoever is watching this. I'm not telling you that there was a hidden empire that taught humanity to live in food forests and was erased by a worldwide conspiracy. I genuinely don't know if that's true. I don't have enough evidence to make that claim. What I am telling you is that the official narrative, the one that describes human food production as a linear march from primitive gathering to sophisticated agriculture, with no meaningful detours, no lost knowledge, no systems worth mourning, that narrative is inadequate. It is inadequate to the evidence, not the fringe evidence, the archival evidence, the botanical surveys and the colonial field notes and the hedgerow composition data and the terra preta distribution maps. Something was there, something large, something sophisticated, something that fed people. And then it wasn't. And the transition from was to wasn't happened faster than any natural process can account for. This is where the mystery becomes, for me, genuinely haunting. Let me leave you with a few images, somewhere in the old-growth forest reserves of the Pacific Northwest, in areas where public access is restricted, where roads don't go, where the management plans of federal agencies specify minimal human interference. There are trees that are 400, 500, 600 years old. Species composition that ecologists describe, in their careful scientific language, as anomalous. Concentrations of useful species, berries, nuts, roots, in combinations that don't occur by chance. In the restricted zones of the Amazon, the places where no roads run and no tourists go, researchers occasionally surface with photographs of terra preta formations of a scale that suggests, if you follow the implications, a human population and a food production system that dwarfs anything in the official historical record. In the highlands of Ethiopia, in forest fragments that survived the colonial clearing, there are coffee trees, wild coffee trees, Coffea arabica, growing in companion with shade trees and medicinal plants in arrangements that botanists freely describe as designed, as if someone at some point decided that this is where the coffee should grow, and this is what should grow with it, and this is how the system should be maintained. These places exist. The restricted access to them is real. The anomalies within them are documented. Why are they restricted? The official explanations vary. Biodiversity conservation, indigenous land rights, military or governmental security zones, research exclusions. Maybe, perhaps each restriction has its own mundane explanation. But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. If you wanted to preserve the physical remnants of a food production system that you had, for whatever reason, decided should no longer be accessible to ordinary people, not the knowledge of it, not the practice of it, not the living tradition of it, but the evidence that it once existed at scale, you might very well fence it off, label it sensitive, restrict access, let the researchers in occasionally under controlled conditions, and let the papers they publish accumulate in journals that nobody reads. You wouldn't destroy it. Destruction creates questions. Restricted access just creates inconvenience. And here's the strangest part, the deepest part, the part that keeps me up at night. If a food forest system, a properly designed, properly managed, multi-species, perennial food forest, was once operating at something approaching continental scale, the implications aren't just historical, they're present tense, because those trees don't die when the people who planted them die. They keep producing, they keep growing, they keep waiting. Somewhere, right now, in a forest that you're not allowed to enter, there are trees that were planted by people whose names we don't know, using techniques we've forgotten, as part of a system we've lost the language to describe. They're still there, waiting. And somebody knows exactly what they are. The question isn't whether a more sophisticated relationship between human beings and forest food systems once existed. The survey records, the soil science, the species distributions, the hedgerow ghosts, they're enough to establish that something was there. The question isn't even precisely what that system was, though that question deserves its own investigation. The question that I find myself unable to resolve, the question that I don't think the official record wants you to ask, is simpler and more devastating than all of those. Who decided you shouldn't have it? Not why. Not when. Not under which legal or political framework the decision was formalized. Not what euphemism was used in the official reports. Who decided that a system of food production requiring almost no labor, no purchased inputs, no centralized infrastructure, a system that made ordinary people anywhere they lived substantially self-sufficient from the land, who decided that this was the thing that needed to go? And what does it mean that we live right now in the world they built instead? I don't know. I'm still looking. But the deeper I go, the more I find that the mystery isn't really about ancient forests or old maps or lost botanical knowledge. The mystery is about the architecture of dependence, about who benefits when people cannot feed themselves, about what gets erased when the answer to that question becomes too obvious. Once you see that, really see it, you can't unsee it. The forest was there, the knowledge was there, the system was there. And then, in the space of a single human lifetime across every continent on Earth, it was gone. Find me a natural explanation for that. Find me an official one. I'll be here, waiting.